Okay, welcome everybody to another episode of Parker X, and this episode we're working on the Deep Tech series, and I'm joined by my partner in crime, Brett Wood, and we're going to talk about smart sensors. I first engaged with, smart sensors when I lived in London, and London in the early 2000s had more CCTV cameras and sonic sensors across the city than I think any other metropolitan area, probably outside of New York City. And then from then I watched that technology emerge, so the parking bay sensors that were subsurface and surface mounted sensors sort of emerge. And it was a technology that was around and looking for an application. And I think that story was true, and it's probably still true a little today as well. We were looking for probably a good 15 years at a market that had a technology that was looking for an application, and the economics of the application and the accuracy and the performance of the application potentially weren't quite there to the degree that required for it to be really useful and really practical. And certainly only in the last, I would say, 5 years it started to hit its feet, and you've seen more players emerge and more municipalities take it on. And it's really a municipality based technology, more than anything else. And we're able to use that technology to layer in other services like mobile experiences, wayfinding, and those are interesting applications that make this technology useful beyond the technology. One of the technology's core promises, which is to improve the efficiency of your enforcement. And there are a range of technologies around now. There's different types of sensors, and there are different types of I'm talking about different types of bay sensors, but then there's also the uses of CCTV now, which is starting to emerge as, I don't want to say a competitor, but a parallel system to use there. And again, they'll go through that cycle of improving their performance and improving their discipline and improving their use case. But I've asked Brett to join us today because I think he has a good insight into an area that I'm interested in, is how you use this technology. Again, back to that question of, it's a technology that's powerful but needs to be used in the right way for a specific purpose. And I felt Brett would be able to elucidate some experiences around where it's shown the most value and the most promise, and how those work in terms of a policy decision to go ahead and deploy these technologies. Brett, welcome.
Thanks, Brett. I will do my best not to embarrass you and prove you wrong. So,
perfect. That's what I'm looking for.
No, it's interesting. I'm like, I had my first experience with sensors early 2010s. I was doing a on-street parking study for the city of Phoenix, and really it was about procuring new parking meters, and they were trying to decide whether they wanted to have single-space meters, multi-space meters, and one of the things that we evaluated as part of the process was, do you want to have space sensors to help? And again, this was early, very, very early in their lifespan. At the time, SF Park in San Francisco was using them in a pretty large quantity for their federal highway project to evaluate demand and occupancy and do demand-based pricing. We had some vendor presentations for the city. We had everybody come in and present stuff, and the sensor guys came in, and their business case was, we can do targeted enforcement. So, we'll have a sensor there. It'll be tied to the meter. If a car doesn't pay, or if they stay over time, we can direct enforcement to go there. And their business case was, you'll write more tickets, you'll have more citation revenue, and therefore you can afford the cost of the sensors, which, you mentioned, the cost has kind of right-sized itself over the past 10 years. But back then, it was fairly expensive to put the sensor in and then maintain the sensor on a monthly basis to get the data out of it. And the city council and the city leadership, didn't like the idea of writing more tickets as they were investing money into the system and raising rates. It just seemed like it was kind of a grab. So they didn't actually use the sensors. And at that time, that was really what they were for. It was for directed enforcement. SF Park was using them for the data stream, but nobody else at the time was really going to the levels of dynamic pricing that SF Park was. And then, later that year, I actually did a study with the Seattle Department of Transportation about implementing their own version of dynamic pricing. And they elected to not put sensors in for two reasons. One, the cost, and then two, the accuracy of the sensors was not high enough for them to get a real predictable pattern of what was happening. So they opted to go with manual counts for their data, for their system, which left them with a lot less data than SF Park would have had, but still allowed them to do the dynamic pricing. And like you said, I mean, over the past 10 years, it really has evolved, and we're seeing more and more and more uses for them. One of my good friends who's been a guest on the podcast with us before, Adam Jones in Tempe, he actually put sensors in. He had single space meters, and he put sensors in, not on the ground mount, but on the dome that could sense the vehicle. And what he used it for was not enforcement or data, but simply to zero out the meters when a car left. So there was no more, gift time for people when they drove up. And I want to say he raised his revenue by like 30% by just getting rid of the free time and having everybody pay for their own transaction. So you start to see more and more use, at least in the on-street realm, where before it was really limited to a couple small things.
I want to touch on the seminal work about the SF Parks. That really, I guess, brought it into focus initially and proved up some of the best applications for it. And they sort of, their trials and their reports sort of started to look at increased availability. So they were increasing their availability significantly off the back of it, something like 25% they were claiming in their area. Search time reductions, greenhouse emissions, drawing a long string potentially, and then vehicle miles traveled looking for parking. By publishing the sensors in those critical areas, they're cutting search time down. Those are interesting aspects that they sort of proved up, I guess, to themselves as they deployed the technology.
They did. Yeah. And the interesting thing, another friend of the podcast, Julie Dixon, who's been on some of our podcasts before, she was over the technology at the time, and she oversaw the procurement of the sensors. They went through two different sensor technologies and companies during that. But yeah, once they got the sensors down, the first group, there was just too much noise from the sensors, specifically in the areas where they had heavy traffic, or in the San Francisco area where they had the streetcars. They were getting so much noise with the sensors that they were getting false reads, and so it wasn't providing the data they needed. But with the second company, they got what they needed, and they used it. And I mean, the pilot that they did was outstanding in terms of proving the value of dynamic pricing and all the Shoupian principles that Dr. Shoup had laid out in the high cost of free parking, and it was extremely successful, to the point that there are programs around the country that are beginning to mimic that. But one of the things that's not mentioned about SF Park, and I like to point this out in presentations I do, they actually turned off most of their sensors after the federal highway grant ran out. And so they probably have some that are functional, but the however many thousands that they had in their own street program, they elected to not keep them going because of the ongoing costs of it. And they weren't getting, the $40 million check from the Federal Highway Administration to run the program. So there's a bit of a toss-up. I mean, it was extremely effective, but it didn't quite get them to the ROI of keeping those things on long term.
Where I am, we're also seeing grants given for smart technology, smart city technology, and this sits in that wheel well. And it's interesting to hear that and see that happen. I can see certainly once the behaviour's changed, you want to move that technology or turn that technology off, or again keep it. And there is a case-by-case, street-by-street decision there to be made, and it is quite strategic. I want to reflect back to the technology for a minute. You did talk about false positives, which is it's an issue with these technologies. Some sensors have multiple means of technology using radar, infrared, magnetic. There's a range of technologies to make these happen, and a range of deployment options. The thing that has changed in the last 5 years is the battery life. So historically, battery life was a real issue, and what it meant was single-use installation. Now companies are able to offer the hardware as a service, so a single monthly fee that can be all-inclusive, that then works for the customer because the technology is mature enough now with the battery use and the way it communicates that it makes it more efficient, more predictable, I guess. I remember having conversations earlier last decade around how long is the battery life commercially, can we stand behind it, what's going to happen with the customer, and the batteries start to fail. So the reliability there is really improved, and I think that's given the market or this sector of this industry a lot more confidence. There are some unintended areas that need to be discovered. You mentioned the vibrations that can happen around, which change the sensors. The sensors are obviously in the surface of the ground. Unless a vehicle parks directly over it, then you don't have a read. So in some municipalities, it means striping the bays correctly so the vehicles do park. If they park straddling, then the technology doesn't work. So there are some other aspects of the technology. It's not just the puck in the ground. It's a relay generally that is talking to multiple sensors in a mesh that's talking back to the infrastructure of the database. Some technology are moving towards each individual sensor having a communication, and that'll emerge, I think, more as 5G starts to roll out and that whole Internet of Things starts to take more of a groundswell. That's interesting technology there. So there are costs associated with the communications back to the database, and there are costs associated with maintaining the battery and the performance of the system long term. So I'm starting also to see two different grades of technology. A sensor that's really looking at providing data where the accuracy doesn't necessarily need to be an enforcement grade, 99%, 99.5%, or absolutely 100% able to go to court and win every case every time when challenged. So two grades there as well, and one to be deployed sort of in a short-term discovery type diagnostic, and another one more of the long-term. We know this is always going to be a problem. We need to support our turnover, and so we'll deploy a solution more long-term. So that's quite interesting, and there's a field of players now, which potentially historically there has been companies come in and out of this technology space based on evolutions of technology that had been created in other industries that were looking for an application in parking, which is a natural thing to do. And so companies have come in and out, but there has been, I guess, some more companies who are more long-term, have more long-term deployment, have been finding funding on the back of more lasting contracts, which couldn't happen if, like you said, Brett, people didn't find a long-term use case for it. They'd use it for a while, turn it off, try it out. The claims in the industry are that ROI is 3 to 6 months, depending on the use case. I want to test that out a little and just talk about what you think the use cases are and the policies that really drive the application of a technology.
Yeah, no, I mean I think that's why we're seeing more success right now, is because people have realized that it's not just enforcement, it's not just resetting the meters, but that data stream that we can get from the sensors, whatever form of sensor we have, whatever application it is, if we can begin to channel that and understand what that data means and apply it to parking regulations, parking management, parking operations, we tend to have more efficient programs that don't necessarily have to be heavy-handed and write more tickets. We can set up pricing like an SF Park would do. We can set up time regulations that will support the businesses around them and can change, by time of day. And you're seeing that in the curb management application where we're, during the day we have certain regulations. At night we have different regulations because that's what the businesses are necessitating. We can use that data to understand how to optimize turnover and where to allocate different regulations so we're getting people to the right parking spaces. We can communicate that data. Obviously, that's one of the bigger things. early and I speak a lot in the on-street realm, but it works more efficiently in the off-street realm. But in the on-street realm, we were really trying to think about helping people understand where parking spaces were available so that we could optimize their experience and reduce the amount of time people were circling. I don't know that that's the best use case because I don't know how you get that information while you're driving safely. But in the off-street world, we can look at facilities. We can reserve parking in spaces in facilities that are available, and we can provide that information in a meaningful way to the customer. So, I mean, communities, municipalities, universities, hospitals, whatever they may be, they're figuring out now how to use this in a meaningful way to make the customer experience better, which naturally drives more revenue because if the customers are happier, there's probably going to be more people parking, and you're going to have more revenue coming out of it on the back end. Even if you're writing less tickets, if you get people complying appropriately because we get them to the right spaces, there's a good chance that your program is going to be more profitable in the long run, which makes this more cost effective. The other thing, and I think you mentioned this, is there's more competition in the market space now, which has driven the price point down, which makes things a lot more compatible to get those things in. So, with lower price points, better accuracy, not 100%, but better accuracy, and this magnitude of ways that we can use the data, I think we're seeing a renaissance with sensors. And one of the things we've been working on pretty heavily, industry related, project related, is commercial loading, different types of things at the curb, and we're seeing a real need to have sensors in those spaces to understand the actual magnitude of how those spaces are being used, right? And the reality of how long people dwell in a commercial loading space, or how long pickup drop off dwells at the curb, and then setting regulation and price associated with it is really helping the communities that I work with better understand how to set up policy in a realm that we've never set up policy before. I mean, it's we've kind of given them the end of the curb and said do what you're going to do with it, but now we're trying to price them and regulate them so that we can manage the overall experience for everyone, which should make things better. So it's kind of becoming a critical part of the package. And again, and you've touched on it a little bit. Initially it was all pucks in the ground. Now we have pucks that sit on top of the ground. We have pucks that sit on top of the meters and do radar. We have cameras. We have license plate recognition. We have CCTV. Whatever you want to do that can sense vehicles, and it's amazing to see how rapidly that evolves. How people are using artificial intelligence to use that data to better understand how their facilities and streets are working.
I'll come back to the use cases in a bit. I think you've talked about a number of really common ones: clearways, metered areas, metered zones, wayfinding, take me there reservation, wayfinding integrated into digital signage. I think that's an interesting one, which really does help control a precinct. The area that is interesting there that you just touched on, which is there are an array of technologies, an array of sensors out there, and largely they exist also in an ecosystem that might have legacy contracts, legacy arrangements, so an enforcement technology, a mobile LPR solution, an e-permitting platform, a mobile pay platform, a reservation platform, wayfinding, street signs. They might have CCTV, as you mentioned, and a whole array of sensors. And then connecting those together and drawing out data and making that data work for the municipality is interesting. You have to certainly, within these arrangements, start to determine your form factors of technology, which ones you're going to apply, then which communications will support those, the commercials around them, the commercial returns, and also the commercial scope delineations between each of the vendors, and where the system breaks down between those communications or needs to change, who's responsible, and how parties can work together in the interests of the municipality rather than that. And that's, I think, an interesting area, a critical area. The integration and integratability. Sometimes there's walls put up between commercial entities. We won't work with that one. We'll work with this one. And there's particular times to have that conversation and nail that correctly. Otherwise, it starts to create issues down the road. Data ownership is interesting as well. So, do you own the data, or is the data the vendor's data? And or are you obligated to share it as part of your arrangement? And does that work for you, or does it work against your interest? Where is your policy sitting on that?
I would urge most of the cities that listen to this podcast or work with us, like try to get control of your data. Like just do the best you can to have some margin of control over it, because it's a powerful tool that you don't want to lose.
Absolutely. Accuracy grade, we touched on that before. It's critical. These sensors offer a lot of data, but they also offer a lot of data that might not be useful or meaningful. And the tactics around where you deploy it and what issue you're looking to solve, I think it does become the essence of whether you go with this solution around the other aspects. And these companies do offer short-term field trials. They're paid trials, but you may find you use one here, and does it impact or affect behavior, yes or no? If it doesn't, then obviously you've proven something to yourself, but you've gone through that experience to find out. You move it to somewhere else. Use cases, the fill patterns. Is that interesting data to you? The way a city fills up in the morning, clears out during the day, clearways, is that interesting data? Clearways is something we have particularly during the evenings and the afternoon, bookends of the day. We have particular times where to help traffic throughput, we stop people from parking particular spaces. Commercial tenancies, commercial shopping areas, are you impacting it with your rates in the way you want to? Are you driving the turnover? Are you missing opportunities there to control behaviour, or is behaviour just not being set correctly? Do you have an instinct, Brett, about where you would put sensors in a community where they would best sit if you're looking to have a community that didn't have these at all?
Yeah, I mean, so if I was working in a community, let's say it had a handful of districts, and one of them was a extremely active kind of commercial district that may have retail during the day, retail restaurant during the day that served the office community, and then restaurant and entertainment type uses at night. So a lot of transition, a lot of change occurring. I'd want to know there. I mean, you pointed out, like, knowing when parking fills up, how long people stay there, when it transitions, if there's a demand for parking in the times that you would have, which y'all call clearways. We call those commute lanes here, but I've worked in communities where the traffic engineers assumed that we had to clear those spaces to move traffic, but if we could show them that there truly was a demand for parking from 4 to 6 p.m., and we're clearing spaces out and having a negative impact on business, we want to show them that. The flip side of that is, if let's say you've got a residential area, I don't really know that you need to have sensors in that area, unless, again, it abuts a commercial district and you've got a lot of turnover and a lot of demand in that area. Places where people stay, long stays, you've got 8-hour parking, things like that. Again, it may not be worth the investment to know what you already know. So I would focus on those areas where you have a lot of change, a lot of competition for the space, so that you can truly understand what's happening and adapt your policy, to that, in support of the businesses around you.
If a city hasn't had this type of technology before and is looking to introduce paid parking meters, do you get a sense that it's a process that takes a while, where they have a range of these types of technologies in place to be put in place? And would you put the sensors in potentially first to track levels of use, and then implement a paid parking or a time-restricted parking arrangement?
Yeah, so, I mean, obviously, once you put a meter out or you put a regulation out, it's going to change people's behavior in some way or another. So if I went first and put sensors in and then tried to understand, that data and how it was going to change over time, I think it might be a little bit, too much of a phase. What I would say is, let's again, if I'm doing a study for a city and it's not, 2020 and everything's up in the air, I'm going to go out and count cars manually as a consultant and tell them, what we observed, and we'll build a policy around that, where Main Street may have 2-hour regulations with $1.50 an hour, and then 2 blocks away we may have 75 cents an hour with 4-hour time limits to serve employees or something like that. I would then say, if you could do a pilot, maybe do a pilot of the sensors, like you pointed out, a lot of these companies will let you test them, and do a pilot and just see how it goes. And if it starts giving you a rich set of data, invest in it. But I typically, most of the communities that I work in don't want to bite off more than they can chew right away, because they're not getting that federal highway grant, so they don't have the money to go put this stuff in. Buy your meters, set your policy, and then just keep collecting data. I go back to SF Park and other communities that don't have the sensors now. They use transaction data from their meters to just kind of observe how trends occur. Is it perfect? No, because you can't capture any, cars that are in violation of your regulations that don't pay, but you get enough of a sense to understand where patterns are. But if you see you've got an area that's in constant turnover, constant competition, it's definitely worth it. And then the old Adam Jones example, if you've got a place where it turns over a lot and you got a lot of short-term stays, you might be able to squeeze out a little bit more revenue by zeroing out those transactions with the sensors.
Yeah, and sensors, I mean, generally, this could be a CCTV sensor as well, a vehicle counting tool like that would be interesting to work through. It would be remiss of us not to talk about sensors and their enforcement benefits. And so it's worth us just talking about that generally. And so generally, you're able, like you said, to reset the meter, which is a really great tool, but also sense overstays, sensor connection, sensor connection to the meter, sensor connection to a permit arrangement that might be in place there to make sure that when your rangers are in the field, they're using their time appropriately, so they know when a specific vehicle is overstayed, so they can direct their route towards those areas where behaviour is being infringed upon, or infringements are occurring.
Yeah, I take a slightly longer term view of that. Like I think when the technology vendors were creating this in the late 2000s, and their idea, and I laugh at this in my head, but they have an enforcement officer in a van somewhere that's got a computer. The little light comes on and says, Main Street and First Ave, we have two violations, and they go screeching out of the garage and go write some tickets, right? Yeah. But in reality, you're not going to do that. In reality, what we're going to do is we're going to figure out where these violations are occurring most often, and adjust our policies and practices so that maybe we can stop some of the violations, and then B, adjust operational routes. So a lot of the cities we work in, we tell them, let's adjust your enforcement officer's route. I mean, they've got a route that they walk or ride now, but if we focused on these 5 or 6 blocks instead of these 5 or 6 blocks, you're likely to get more violations and change that behavior. And the sensors can give you that data where you might not have it from traditional citation data. If we see that cars continue to overstay their transaction, let's send people there on a daily basis to monitor that and try to improve that behavior.
I think you're right. What you said there was rangers have a normalized sort of behavior pattern. They'll infringe early in the morning, or they'll do a run early in the morning, then they'll come back after lunch, do another run, and that'll be it. And then that middle of the day, those in-between gaps are areas that activity is occurring, and it's often somewhat blind to the range. So that's an interesting area. If you connect that back to the use case of short-term changing behaviour for a particular problem area, getting the policy right, then the sensors in those use cases start to become less valuable over time, which I think is an important area to look at, because you're treating an area, you're making the outcome, you're generating the better outcome, and then you're moving on. And I think that's a practical use of these sensors, and something that will continue on forever. They're really not a type of technology, at least the puck sensors aren't the type of technology. Maybe the CCTV cameras ultimately get to a position where they're more pervasive. Let's say Big Brother becomes, by the end of this decade, something that we see everywhere, then absolutely you could see it across the city, but that the puck's certainly not something that you would put in every street, every area as a pervasive technology.
I don't think that's necessary. I don't think you need to outfit every space that you own with a sensor.
It's amazing how quickly 30 minutes goes by when we
when
talk
you're having
about
fun and
this sort
talking
of
parking, right?
It's unreal. So I think we might put a pin in it there. So some interesting areas there, lots of technology, an area of the industry that's certainly moving quickly and moving in a way that it's interesting and creating great outcomes for municipalities, and something that'll only be more of an area of interest, I think, as networks become more evolved in the next 24 months or so and 5 years out. But it also raises some interesting, with the emergence of any new type of technology or any more compelling type of technology. I don't want to say it's new because it has been around a while. It's just emerging as something that's showing more usefulness. That range of technologies there raises some interesting discussions around the form factor and where you use it, where you deploy it, the commercial aspects of the contracts and the returns that we touched on, integratability with other systems that you have, and your accuracy goals and your strategic outcomes. So really interesting conversation, Brett. I think it'll be interesting for people to listen to, hopefully.
I hope so, yes.
Great. All right. Thanks for joining me. And next time we'll talk about hot air balloons or something as equally interesting as parking.
Right. And I'm just ready for a lot of these travel restrictions to end so I can come sit on that patio with you and look out over the veranda.
This is absolutely where I live. Good talking to you. Let's chat again next week.
Absolutely, man. Have a good one.
Thank you for listening to the Parker X podcast. We sincerely appreciate it and hope you are enjoying our content. Please remember to rate, review, comment, subscribe, and share. And follow us on LinkedIn, Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter. The following has been a production of Parker X.